out a request to many of our advisory boards and provider sites. And if any of you have any recommendations or resources that you would think would be helpful for inmates to have on these tablets, please leave us a message in the chat and we'll certainly reach out to you in regards to that information. And then we're always encouraging all of you to please share the information around wanting to have people share their story, because the stories of the meth epidemic matter. The people matter in our community that are struggling with meth. And it's certainly a ripple effect, like the documentary I spoke about earlier mentions. It's a ripple effect with not just fentanyl, but with methamphetamine, not just on the person, but on their family members, on the community. And so if you yourself, or have a loved one or friend that would like to share their story, please send it into dhs-supt@saccounty.net. And looking forward, at the end of the agenda this afternoon, Dr. Ira Chasnoff will be joining us, speaking about the impacts of methamphetamine use on pregnancy. And so he will be joining about 2:45, and we have some other great presentations prior to him joining us, and I'll give a more robust introduction when he's online with us. And then, as always, I want to thank all of you that are partners in this effort to address methamphetamine here in Sacramento County. We have many partnerships and collaborations, many organizations and entities that it really takes all of us to come together to address this. So thank you all. So before I move on in the agenda, one last item I'd like to address is just a brief disclaimer. So if anything in this meeting brings up some uncomfortable feelings for people, some concerns, some issues, if folks have questions about treatment or questions in general, I'm going to have you direct those questions directly to our colleague, Kimberly Grimes. She's our Substance Use Prevention and Treatment Health Program Manager, and she's going to be putting her contact information in the chat. So again, if any of the content brings up anything for you and you'd like to speak to somebody, we have a staff member available to you. So Kimberly will put that information in the chat, and please don't hesitate to let us know if you have those questions. Okay, any questions before we jump into the next agenda item? Okay, well, thank you all again for joining us. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Kimberly Grimes, our Health Program Manager, and she has been wonderful in improving the work that we do around equity, diversity, and inclusion here in Sacramento County across behavioral health, and certainly within substance use prevention and treatment. And so we've added a standing agenda item called Reaching Diverse Communities. And so Kimberly organizes different folks to come in and share with us. So Kimberly, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Yes, we're really excited this month. We've asked Albert Tittman to join us. He's the Deputy Director of the Native Dads Network. Their kind of main focus and goal is to heal generational trauma, and he's going to provide lots of really interesting. We had just a brief conversation, and the information he was providing to me, I was really kind of shocked and surprised at the way that methamphetamine is affecting our tribal communities. So very pleased to welcome Albert. Thank you, Albert.
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly. And Lori, it's good to see you again. Man, you are a busy woman, that's for sure. Majuksasa, Kuchi, Kalupa, Nixe, Kanyasas, Albert Tittman, Nishanan, Miwok, Maidu, and Madesi Band of the Pit River Nation. Hello, relatives. Welcome. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share. My tribal heritage is Nisenan, Miwok people, Maidu people from this area here up and down the river systems, the Sacramento, the Kosume, and the McClellan rivers. And our belief is that our creation started not far from here, where Sacramento County now is the home for a lot of us, right? Very diverse county. So we believe that as a result, our creation started thousands of years ago, and we have existed here on the land of our ancestors, being good stewards of the land, which means in our creation, we believe that, we were created of the area, the water, the trees, plants, animals, air, fire. There's a long story of how we believe we came to be. And so in keeping with stewardship, it really means that we take care of the land that created us and took care of us and continues to do that as human beings. So the term Ewok really means human being. You're a human, you're a person, you're a people. And so there's been a rich history in the state of California, especially with the issues that we're facing here today, methamphetamine being one that hasn't left us. The opioid crisis is devastating tribal communities. And there's a reason why. We can go way back. We can start with first contact and colonization and mission era, which all of those would be valid. And the gold rush era, indentured servitude, the bounties placed on the head of California tribal people, especially this region, and the governor of California at that time, placing a dollar amount, a bounty on the scalps of men, women, and children to exterminate the tribal people of this area. They did a really good job. And so historical, intergenerational impacts, multi-generational impacts is one of the indicators for us currently why we have these issues in our tribal communities. And more recently, the boarding school era, where the government came in and forcefully removed tribal children from their families, from the land that we were moved to. And originally we lived here along the river system. Then we were moved up to now. There are bands, rancherias, they call them reservations. There's a distinction between both. We won't go into today, but and so the people were placed there, and then their children were taken away. 3, 4 generations, 5 generations in some cases of tribal children removed from their family, their tribe, and taken to boarding schools across the state of California, even into other states. And so I share that briefly because I have a larger presentation that we present to different entities, government agencies, school districts around cultural awareness and sensitivity, because we're facing these issues like substance use disorder. Alcoholism's never left us. We've been dealing with alcoholism for centuries now as tribal people, and it actually is still the #1 cause of death. Alcohol-related deaths are the #1 killer of tribal people across the United States, and some reservations and rancherias worse than others, because we are adopting, strategies to help us deal with the issues that we're facing. And so the boarding school era, my father, my grandmother, my grandfather, his grandfather, his father, so my great-great-grandfather, there's 3 generations of the men in my family that were taken to boarding school and stripped of their language, their identity, ethnic cleansing, internal genocide. And these strategies continued for generations amongst our people, where we were forced into Christianity, religion, to wear the clothes of, the colonizer, and there's a lot more that we could go into, and I want to share how that is linked. So when my father came home and his father had come home, they were raised by that system. They were taught how to be in the system that, in essence, from our perspective, despised us, didn't consider us human being, thought of us as less than, and therefore had to kill the Indian in each one of the children and save the man, the human. And hence, generations later, like because I'm 1 generation removed from my father, had no parenting skills. It was an attack on our family systems. So when we think about healthy, functional family systems, or alcoholic family systems, or addicted family systems, we, as a tribal community, we and we are advocating it, educational institutions that teach about modalities to help us heal, relapse prevention methods to help us find a path of healing. And it has to include understanding the history of how we came to be, why we are facing these issues in our communities. And then as tribal people, we have to learn that as well, because we're trapped in this mindset in many cases of victimization, right? This happened to me. And so therefore I have to constantly be on guard, because in tribal community, we continue to see the oppression. We're feeling it in school districts, especially public schools, as a result. And so we eventually those children came home, and they came back to the rancherias and reservations. Many of them may have been relocated to urban centers, and treaties were promised and never ratified, where the promise, and I'll say for my family, we were relocated from the rancheria up near Ione back down to the city of Sacramento near the river. However, we were placed in the ghetto, and there was a promise of housing and healthcare and education. Those are written in an act of law, and none of that was ever truly ratified. And so we had to survive now in the ghetto with other ethnic groups and impoverished communities. And so we have urban natives, we have rancheria, which are more urban, rural, and we have frontier tribal communities, which are set farther apart than any of the other groups, farther apart from city centers, which means resources, access to healthcare, access to mental health services, substance use disorder services. And so currently in the United States of America, there are 579 federally recognized tribes. And in the state of California, 109 of those exist. And of those 109, California has the highest population of tribal people from those reservations and rancherias, as well as tribes that have been relocated generations ago, and their families still live in the centers, mostly the city centers, urban centers. And so, methamphetamine has been around for a while. It's another one of those I refer to them as, the spirit of meth, or the spirit of opioids. But I want to share some information with all of you. If I have the opportunity to share my screen. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation, but I want to share this information. So it really just kind of talks about some data on the current issues that we're facing in tribal community and the methamphetamine issue in tribal communities. So meth obviously is affecting us across the country. Addiction has no discrimination. It doesn't care what race, what ethnicity, socioeconomic status. Addiction is addiction. In the spirit of methamphetamine, there's no rules, no boundaries. However, infiltrating and devastating our communities, this drug is disproportionately devastating tribal communities in the United States of America. And we know that organized crime has purposely, and Mexican cartels get a lot of the credit or blame, but have purposely been targeted, especially the more rural native reservations, both the sale, the manufacturing, sale, and distribution in the United States, especially around in California. Native Americans now experience the highest meth use rates of any group in the nation. And I want to remind you, we're talking about per capita, because we're only 1.5% of the entire population. The opioid crisis is literally killing our youth on rancherias and reservations. And and it's devastating because we're only 1.5% of the population. The age of 15 to 35-year-olds are overdosing and dying, or overdosing at a high rate. What we're seeing is that is the birthing age for tribal people, for human beings in general. So in a tribal community, if you have, let's say, 1,000 tribal members living in this community, and your 35 to 40-year-olds, or 15 to 35-year-olds are overdosing and dying because this epidemic is really having a negative effect on tribal communities, then you're talking about a generation that won't give birth, or be very few. And so we're seeing that in our California tribal communities, from rural reservations to the more urban reservations. Some of these cartels target Native American communities, and the reasons are complex. One of them is criminal jurisdictional issues, because many of the reservations and rancherias are on federally recognized either trust land or governmental land. And so jurisdictional issues become an issue, which means that the county or the city police, unless they are working closely with tribal government, tribal police, they won't cross the jurisdictional boundaries, because for a lot of reasons, lawsuits, sovereignty, the rights for tribal people to govern and police themselves. And so this complex nature where these cartels or other criminal entities, they have found that they can infiltrate and set up their shops there. And so what we're seeing, sometimes they'll marry in, have kids, and they've set up shop where they know they're safe from punity. Or the reservations and rancherias are so small that they come in and they take over the entire government, or they live in abject poverty, and criminal organization might come in and offer you $10,000 to set up on your property. And that becomes a business proposition for a reservation or rancheria that's living in abject poverty. And it's interesting because a lot of relatives, there's some stereotypes or some miseducation around tribal communities and money, free money, government money, or tribal communities and gaming. And out of the 579 tribes, or maybe 10% of those tribes have gaming, and maybe 5% of those are very successful, where they're making a lot of money. California has a couple of tribes that are making pretty good money. And the issue with that, I won't name the tribe, but there's one tribe locally that had been living in abject poverty for decades, if not centuries. And they were living in abject poverty. And I mean, they had shanty homes and outhouses in their properties. And they were met with organizations that found a loophole to set up casinos on the property, bingo halls first. And they were entered into compacts with the state of California and other entities to help them establish a casino and a resort ultimately. And those relatives, within 5 years, benefited with a monthly per cap payment, because now they become casino owners. And they were given $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 a month. And so when you have an oppressed people living in abject poverty for decades, if not a century, and they have not received adequate education, especially around managing money, and some of the other issues, the historical intergenerational impacts. Many had learned how to self-medicate get through some of those hardships. And when you give someone who is dependent on a drug or alcohol $10,000 and they go from hustling to $10,000 in their hand, well, it's like putting gasoline on a fire. And so what we've seen with some of our relatives who initially had received money for their self-reliance opportunity, that we seen some of our relatives in those communities struggle as a result of living in abject poverty and then one day receiving a $10,000 check in the mail. And so since then, though, that tribe has really drafted policy around self-reliance and receiving your first allotment at the age of 18. There's some policies in place for that tribe that says they have to they have to be successful in school, graduate. There's then receive some college level accounting courses and really life skill money management courses. And so as well as adopting some culturally centered and founded treatment approaches, similar to the Native American Health Center in Sacramento, where I worked for 15 years and helped develop that program in the behavioral health department. And so tribal leaders are finally now at the forefront to create those solutions and approaches in those communities that might be helpful in their struggles. And so again, today, we continue to lead the nation in these statistics. And so some of the highest, thank you, grandson. Close the door, please. Nationally, Native Americans and Alaska Native Hawaiians have the highest rates of meth use. In studies of the past year or so, Native communities use rates 1.7 for American, 2.2 for Native Hawaiians. And this rate is substantially higher than other ethnic groups across the country. And I mean, there was a time where in our our Hawaiian relatives, the glass, they used to call it glass and, crystal. And I mean, it was devastating, our relatives in the islands there. And in honestly, it's evolved, but some of that type of crystal is now permeating across the country in the United States. It's actually being manufactured on reservations and rancherias. And so some of our more rural abuse rates have been seen as high as 30% in one tribal community. In May, the White Mountain Apache of 2006 testified in front of the Senate that 30% of their tribal employees tested positive for meth use. And even today, it's interesting because we're talking about data from 2006. And today we are continuing to see those numbers because, like our relatives shared early, that now we have this new epidemic. We're focusing all of our resources and attention on the opioid crisis. It's almost like we have to pick our poison that we're going to try to fight. And we're in tribal community, it's no different. Because we have these other layers in tribal community. For us here at Native Dads Network, we have, it's been dangerous. You travel to a tribal community. We've traveled to certain tribal communities. I won't name them. And, you're met with that type of resistance to the point where, we're sharing about healing, wellness, recovery, and you're met with stay in your lane. You better stay in your lane. And it's time to leave. And the beauty of it is that I get to leave. and leave those relatives there on their Rancheria reservation, because what we're proposing. And the beautiful thing is there are a lot of treatment programs and really culturally founded, culturally centered programs available across the United States. And in tribal communities. And I've been blessed to help direct, be managers of outpatient support, our inpatient or residential programs. I was a part of a recent study with the University of Southern California, set on a cab with them to research all of the culturally centered treatment programs in California. It was a 2-year study, and out of that study, we did not find one in the state of California tribally centered, tribally managed, owned, operated detox program. There's not one, there wasn't any, and there still isn't to this day. And there are a number of treatment opportunities, but one of the things in our communities, and we're addressing the demand, right? And demand, we're doing our best to help our relatives find a path of healing and recovery and wellness, and learning to integrate the Western. A few years back, maybe a decade or so, cultural integration was huge for tribal community. We were really excited because even our own clinics were open to bringing in some culturally centered approaches like talking circles, or even having access to a sweat lodge. We could take our program participants. That's huge, and it helped many at some level. But what we realized more recently is that it felt like there was a lot of resistance by licensed people or science, evidence-based approach. Even some of our community defined practices that was backwards. Because in many of these tribal communities, the culture already there. We needed to take the Western approaches of relapse prevention, 12-step, COG-B, trauma-informed COG-B. I mean, it's really evolved, and integrate that into the tribal community. Whereas we've been doing it backwards, and we found a lot of resistance that way. So long story short, to address the reason why we have so many families in the child welfare system, we can go back. I shared a little bit. Boarding school really taught us that became the norm, taking children from their families and placing them in somewhere else because there was a belief or an attitude that tribal people just weren't civilized, weren't human enough. And at some point, and it's not that long ago, relatives, I just want to kind of hammer that home, that my father, recently died a few years ago. My father was a product of that school and what he experienced in the boarding school, and many elders. I was going to share that video. I don't think it's appropriate for today, and we just don't have the time. I'd love to come back and just do a full-on cultural awareness and competency to help you understand. And maybe some of you already know the deeper dive into why we are the way we are in tribal communities, and how we can come together as human beings when a Native is sent to your program, and they seem like they're resisting. They seem like they don't want to be a part of. They don't trust. Well, there's a reason why. There's a reason why. And I'd love to continue to be a part of this coalition. Honestly, I don't know why there isn't Native representation in this coalition in Sacramento. Because
there is now, Mr. Titman, but we're going to need to wrap up here shortly. But I wanted to have opportunity for folks to ask you questions, because the information you shared was very impactful, very alarming data, and we want to give you at least 4 or 5 minutes to field any questions, and then we'll have to move on. But absolutely, we'd love for you to continue to work with us and provide us more information, and we're happy that you're here. So thank you.
I just want to add one more thing, Lori, and for me, the biggest issue is access. We're not, in tribal community, we're frustrated, we're scared, we're overwhelmed because the supply is not being addressed at all. These relatives on these lands in many of the reservations and rancherias where this methamphetamine is filtering into Sac County. I'm at this place in my life where, I have grandchildren here. I have children, families that I work with, the whole tribe right down the street. And we're dealing with the problems as they surface, right here. This is what we can deal with. Sometimes we'll say, oh, well, they're not ready. But in some of these communities, they're being controlled. It's just crazy. And nothing is being done about that. Literally nothing. And so this is almost a cry for help. What can we do? Law enforcement in here, because if there's law enforcement, what can you do? And so I just want to end with that and say thank you for giving me the opportunity to share a little piece of my heart, a little piece of our history with all of you, because this has been a long battle. And I'm a person of long-term abstinence and sobriety and recovery. And I'll tell you, it's working as a substance use disorder counselor. It's bittersweet for us in tribal communities. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Albert, and thank you for sharing. And so sorry to hear about your father as well. So we would love for you to come back and continue to join our coalition. And we'll go ahead and take a few moments for any questions for Albert. And then thank you, Kimberly. She put your contact information in the chat so folks can reach out directly to you. So any questions for Mr. Tittman?
And there are no wrong questions. Don't feel ashamed or guilty or embarrassed to ask a question, because you've been doing this work so long that I appreciate and value ally and allyship. Whether because sometimes some of us have like some questions that you don't realize. Sometimes you just don't realize we have implicit biases, like you just don't know, right? So I would say that because it's a sensitive subject.
It's certainly a gap in our service system in terms of access to care. So would certainly love to talk with you further about that and how we can be more supportive. Thank you. Any questions and some great comments there in the chat for you, Albert? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so maybe some will come up later.
Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. I just got my thing off of mute. And I was just wondering, with the tribal organization, how have they been about trying to police or find out which ones are bringing in or selling it? I mean, is it like, are they selling it on tribal land? Or are they trying to meet people off and then giving it to them and trying to recruit them that way? Or how are they actually kind of doing it, I guess?
So I don't know if any of you have ever visited a reservation or a rancheria, especially the more rural frontier communities. Is the government set many tribes far apart from the city centers, and many times you have to travel an hour to get on the reservation, into the mountains, into the valleys, the forest, or maybe even an hour and a half. And so it becomes prime location for those criminal entities to set up shop. And so they set up shop, somehow find their way in. So many times we're realizing through, a romantic relationship, but and once they gain a foothold, they, impoverish communities, people that are living in abject poverty, that don't have casinos and other resources available, that growing cannabis, on your land it's a business proposition. Manufacturing is a business proposition. Distribution is a business proposition. So they bring in the business proposition, which means money, I can give you money. And if you do drugs, I have an endless supply of drugs. Here it is. And so, when, I don't know if you all know, but I'm going to assume, because you're all professionals in this line of work, is you can literally control an entire community with drug distribution, especially a drug as powerful as methamphetamine, right? Stimulants. I mean, we're witnessing it in tribal community. Like, I see it in ghettos and barrios here in the city. It's powerful to know that. And so that's what they do. They come in and they set up and as sort of a business proposition, and then they distribute it out. And yeah, they do meet people, and the drugs end up in the big cities where they can make a lot more money.
Yeah,
And
thank
so
you.
probably sometimes the young native people become like the coyotes.
Mhm. Yes.
The impacts are
Thank you.
devastating. Yeah, thank you, Robin, for your questions.
Yeah, thank
So
you very much. I
yeah.
appreciate it.
we will need to transition to our next speaker, but certainly any questions, feel free to put them in the chat for Albert or reach out to us and we'll make sure we get them to
Or
him.
send me an email,
Yes, and
contact me.
Kimberly put your information in the chat, so.
Absolutely.
Okay,
you.
so we are going to transition to our next speaker, Dr. Ira Chasnoff, who is a pediatrician and award-winning author, researcher, and lecturer. He is one of the nation's leading researchers in the field of child development and the effects of maternal alcohol and drug use on the newborn infant, child, and adolescent. So we are certainly pleased and grateful to have partnered with Dr. Chasnoff on a few of our initiatives and projects here in Sacramento County, specifically the Safer Sacramento project, as well as the Healthy Beginnings project. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chasnoff to our Meth Coalition meeting, and he will be speaking about the impacts of meth on pregnancy. Welcome, Dr. Chasnoff.
Thanks, Laurie. It's good to see you. And I do recognize some of the names on the list here that I've had the opportunity to meet you before. I'm going to share my screen. So Laurie asked me to give you an overview of the impact of methamphetamine use during pregnancy. And so some of this may be information you already know, but it relates directly to pregnancy. So I want to start with how methamphetamine does have its action on the nervous system. As many of you probably know, the way our nervous systems work is electrical messages get passed down the nerve pathway. And then when a nerve gap appears, the catecholamine system must transmit that electrical message across the nerve gap before the message can move on. And once the catecholamines have accomplished their task, there is reuptake. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the usual catecholamines. There's dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. We're going to talk about dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that picks up the electrical message, carries it across, releases it, and then there is reuptake of the dopamine, which is why we never run out of dopamine. Now, so dopamine is known as the regulatory center of the brain. So if I want my fingers to wiggle, I'm sending that electrical message to my fingers, and then through reuptake, my fingers stop wiggling. So essentially, dopamine has regulated how much I wiggle my fingers. But dopamine is not only the regulatory center of the brain located in the prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain, it's also the pleasure center. So the reason people use drugs is to get an excess of dopamine at the distal nerve ending. That's what produces the high. So what methamphetamine does is a massive release. It causes massive release of dopamine across the nerve ending. I could take you, here's just cocaine. Dopamine is released at normal levels, but cocaine blocks dopamine reuptake. Marijuana opiates, any drug you want to name, the purpose is to get high dopamine levels. Now, methamphetamine is a big player in this. Now, if we were to take a break right now and you went out and had a bite of food, and it doesn't matter what kind of food, food raises dopamine levels about 125%. Now, if we took a break and you went out and had sex, sex raises dopamine levels about 150 to 175%. So you can see there's not that much difference between eating and having sex. But then if you smoke a cigarette, nicotine raises dopamine levels 200%, cocaine and opiates about 300%, methamphetamine raises dopamine levels a little over 1,000%. So that's why methamphetamine is so popular, because you get this massive release of dopamine. So dopamine is the regulatory center, the pleasure center, and then it has a third action. Dopamine acts on smooth muscle to cause smooth muscle to contract, which is why the first thing that happens when somebody uses, for example, meth, is that you get a rapid heartbeat because the heart is all smooth muscle. The other place there's smooth muscle is around the arteries. So you get constriction of arteries. And think about it for a minute. If you've used meth, your heart's beating fast, your blood vessels constrict down, what happens to blood pressure? It shoots up. So when somebody dies of a methamphetamine overdose, it's usually cardiovascular, either a heart attack or a stroke. Now, half the population of the world has an organ that's all smooth muscle, and it's called the uterus. So that when a pregnant woman uses methamphetamine, she immediately gets contractions of the uterus, which is why there's such a high rate of prematurity in the infants. So if you go into your hospitals in Sacramento, you'll find relatively high rates of premature babies, and that's defined as any baby that's born before 36 weeks gestation. So you'll see high rates of prematurity and also low birth weight babies. Low birth weight is defined as less than 5 pounds, 8 ounces at birth. And what happens, some very interesting studies have been done up in the New York area. Researchers injected sheep, pregnant sheep, with cocaine, and then they injected them with methamphetamine. And what they showed is when you inject the drug into the pregnant mother sheep, you get not only contractions of the uterus, but the umbilical arteries that move the blood from the mother to the fetus constrict down. And so they measured oxygen levels in the fetus. And what they showed is every time the mother got a hit of cocaine or methamphetamine, the fetus became hypoxic. It basically started strangling. It couldn't get enough oxygen, which is why the babies are so low birth weight. They then let the mother and the fetus recover, and then took the drug and injected it directly, went up through the cervix and injected it directly into the fetus. And what they showed from this research is the effect on the unborn child is worse if you give it to the mother than if you give it directly to the fetus, because many of the effects of the methamphetamine are due to this lack of oxygen supply to the fetus. You also get failure to thrive. That's when a baby is born and he doesn't gain weight appropriately. And the main reason there with methamphetamine exposed infants is when they're born, they're so neurologically overloaded from the methamphetamine that the only way they can protect themselves is by shutting down. And so they don't wait to feed. They sleep a lot. I've had 3 infants that died of starvation in the first 2 weeks of life because the babies never woke up to feed, and the mothers were using meth and weren't paying attention. The other issue is dysmorphology. Now, malformations is when at the time of conception, the organs don't form normally. Dysmorphology is when the organs form normally initially, but then something happens during the pregnancy that disrupts the normal development of the organs. Now, this is an animal study where a mother rat was injected with the drug, and then 24 hours later, the baby rat was delivered, and you can see all the hemorrhaging, the damage from the vascular damage from the injection of the drug into the mother. Now, the question, I'm going to stop here just briefly. Do you have any questions? I'm going so fast. I hope I'm giving you at least some understanding.
There were a couple of questions in the chat, Dr. Chasnoff.
Go ahead. Oh,
Let me see here. So
I can try and pull it up there. I got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, does food raise dopamine because of the action of chewing and eating the food? No, food is just a stimulant. It makes us feel good. It acts on the prefrontal cortex of the brain to release dopamine. Does it cause an increase in miscarriages? Yes, whoever picked up on that, very good. Yeah, if you use meth early in pregnancy, it will cause an early abortion. So many women who are using meth never even know they're pregnant. Now, later in pregnancy, it depends on what stage you are in pregnancy. It's called either an abortion, or then it moves into a miscarriage, and then into stillbirths also. But all of those occur because in relation to methamphetamine use. So the pregnancy outcomes are terrible. I have been working the last couple of years on a reservation in South Dakota, and the rate of stillbirths was extraordinarily high. And so we've been doing a lot of prevention work and have reduced the rate of stillbirth significantly there. But it takes a lot of hard work. It takes a community-wide effort. So so the question always comes up, what if the woman is pregnant, it finds out she's pregnant and stops using? Is there any effect early in pregnancy? And in order to understand this, and also to understand what happens to the children long term, let's talk about how the brain works. I talked earlier about how the nervous system works, but now let's look at the brain. As you're listening to this presentation, here's what your brain is doing. It's taking in the information, organizing it, storing it in memory, so that at some point when you want to recall this information, you can feed it up into your prefrontal cortex, where dopamine guides you on how to use the information. So let's just take a very simple example. Let's say you're walking along the street, and you're walking along the sidewalk. You get to a street, and you look to see if a car is coming. The image of that car enters your eye, hits your brain, flash, there's the car. Now, how do you know what to do in response to the car? That information is fed up to the prefrontal cortex in the front of your brain, so dopamine can fire off and tell you to stop walking. So these are the various parts of the brain: the frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, temporal, and then the part of the brain I keep talking about, the prefrontal cortex. You don't have to remember the parts of the brain, but what you need to understand is information enters the brain through different pathways. Anything you see enters your eye, travels along the optic nerve, and hits the back of the brain. It's called the visual cortex. Anything you hear enters the ear and inserts on the middle part of the brain, and taste, touch, and smell enter the parietal lobe. The job of the brain is to bring all that information together and then to feed it up to the prefrontal cortex so you know how to respond. So that's how you knew how to stop walking when you saw a car coming, is because that visual information entered the brain, shot forward to the prefrontal cortex, and your dopamine said, stop walking. This is because the dopamine is the regulatory center of the brain. Now, I just showed you this graphic earlier, but there's something I didn't tell you. For example, with methamphetamine, remember, you get massive release of dopamine across the nerve ending. But over time, what happens is you begin to deplete your dopamine receptors. With cocaine, you deplete your dopamine receptors.
Dr. Chasnoff, there's a couple of questions. One is, we're working on implementing the SBIRT at our institution using CMCQQ Quality Initiative. What resources in our community can aid us in this implementation?
Well, one of the things I would like to do, that's great, but for pregnant women, the only instrument that has been validated for pregnant women is something called the 4Ps Plus, which as part of our contract, and we invented the 4Ps Plus, I don't know how to say it, but part of our contract with Sacramento County is to train providers in how to use the 4Ps Plus. So that's available to you. If you want more information, please, Laurie knows how to contact me. NIH has done separate studies of screening instruments for pregnant women, the World Health Organization, the U.S. Prevention Services Task Force, and they all concluded the only validated instrument for pregnant women is the 4Ps Plus. And I would love to be in contact with you, and we'll get you trained and get you started using the 4Ps Plus. It's 5 questions. I've got all sorts of data we can show you.
Yeah, I can, Jessica, if you want to leave your information in the chat, I'll get a hold of you and provide Dr. Chasnoff's contact, and you can be in direct communication with him. And then a couple of more questions, Dr. Chasnoff, since you're on this. Does Ritalin also downregulate dopamine receptors?
No. Wow. Could we have an hour and 40 minutes instead of 40 minutes? No, all the Ritalin does is help release what dopamine is there. Now, there are other medications that act in different ways, but for our purposes today, just consider the release of dopamine as the key action of the Ritalin.
And then last question, what would be the medication for a child with prenatal exposure and is presenting as ADHD if ADHD medication has a negative impact?
Well, that requires a full evaluation of the child. And most of my work over my career has been asking the question, how do you evaluate a child? And that's actually the last slide. So here's how you do it. It is now agreed in the research and clinical literature that to evaluate a child properly, no matter what their background is, you have to evaluate them across 3 domains of functioning. Neurocognitive, which includes not only global cognitive development like IQ, but also executive functioning, and things like working memory. I'll give you an example of working memory just so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. You need to answer them out loud, okay? Do it softly so you don't bother other people around you. All right, here's your first task. Tell me your telephone number. Go ahead. I want to see mouths moving that you're answering. Okay, good. Great. You pulled that information out of long-term memory. All right, here's your next question. Tell me your telephone number backwards. Okay, now, Melissa, I hope you don't mind, but you happen to be up on my screen and I saw what you did. You're a good sport, right? Do you mind if I talk about you? So here's what I said, tell me your telephone number backwards. Melissa looked up. So what she did is she posted her telephone number and then read it backwards. Melissa is a visual learner. And many of you, that's exactly what you did. And that's what I do. I post my telephone number, I can read it backwards. Now, some of you are auditory learners. So you said your number forward very quickly and then said it backwards. You memorized it. Either way, that's called working memory, to take information out of your brain and use it to accomplish a task. That's working memory. Children with prenatal methamphetamine exposure have very poor working memory. But so they say, so you say, okay, poor working memory, these other things, he was exposed to meth, I'll put him on Ritalin, but it doesn't work or he gets worse. So the next thing you do is this next task I'm going to give you. You ready? Tell me your telephone number backwards. Okay, see, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go through that whole process again, because you knew knowing your telephone number backwards is not important, so you threw it away. You didn't put it into long-term memory. So when we're evaluating children, of course, the tests are much more sophisticated than what I just did with you, but children with prenatal methamphetamine exposure have poor working memory, but they do a pretty good job of moving information from short-term into long-term memory. A characteristic of alcohol-exposed children is they have poor working memory, but they also have great difficulty moving information from short-term to long-term. So we can do neuropsychological tests that begins to decipher that to tell us what we're dealing with. We get into self-regulation. That's the ability to regulate behavior and emotions. And then we get into adaptive functioning, which is communication, which is social skills, which is knowing how to tell time. Adaptive functioning deficits are characteristic of alcohol-exposed children. Children with prenatal methamphetamine exposure have very good adaptive functioning. So in answer to your question, how do you know what medications to use? I look at it from the perspective of we do neuropsychological testing, and then we decide what part of the brain we need to treat. Is it the prefrontal cortex alone, or is there limbic system involvement, which is the middle part of the brain that we haven't talked about tonight at all? So eventually, someday, I would love if in Sacramento County, we had clinical teams that knew how to do these kinds of assessments so children do get the correct diagnoses. We published an article just about 3 years ago now. We took 3,000 drug and alcohol exposed children that had been referred to our clinic, and we looked at what their diagnoses were when they came to us and what their diagnoses were after we did our full evaluation. What percent of children do you think are misdiagnosed? 85.6%. And of all the children that got sent to us on medication, 90% of them we took off medication because they didn't need medication. They needed the kind of therapy that we provide. So that's why in the big picture, this is so important. Methamphetamine, yes, it has tremendous implications for pregnancy, prematurity, low birth weight. I told you about that, but it has even greater implications when you start looking at the school system. And we just last month published an article on the opiate epidemic and looked at children from across the United States, 6,000, I believe it was 6,000 children. And we looked at children with prenatal opiate exposure and compared them to their siblings with no exposure. And we showed that the need for special education in opiate-exposed children is 2.1 times higher than their siblings who were not exposed. So doing the study in that way, we controlled for genetics and home environment. So that article just came out. It's making quite a splash in the medical community. But those are the kinds of things that we need to bring into Sacramento County. We need to look at these issues because every system you can name is being affected by prenatal methamphetamine exposure and other exposure. And that's the whole purpose of Healthy Beginnings. So I'm going to put in a little plug here. When we came, and I have to give credit, we were trying to come up with the name, and Laurie was the name that came up with the name Healthy Beginnings, which is a perfect name. So Laurie, thank you. But we want Sacramento families to thrive. So our mission is to promote a healthy and safe environment for families and children through outreach and education for professionals and community members. And we have specific goals around prevention, education. Let's skip that. And so really, I invite you to go to our website. And we have created not only a website that is full of great information, but also it links to a whole big social media campaign, which also links into Safer Sacramento. And I have to brag on our social media team. Just last, I don't know, a few months ago, Sacramento County won an international award for a social media campaign about fentanyl, which is part of the Safer Sacramento. The first place winner was the United Nations. Third place was MTV, and we won the silver medal for the social media campaign. So that's pretty cool for a California county to get recognized that way. So I'm out of breath. I've been talking so fast, but I hope I've given you at least a taste of what methamphetamine can do. And most importantly, there is prevention, there is intervention. And that's what Healthy Beginnings is all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chadnoff. A couple more questions in the chat for you. If we would like to read the article, where can we find it?
We can't post article. I don't know which article you're talking about, but anything you can contact me through the Healthy Beginnings website. And I certainly don't mind if you email me directly. It's just my name, irachasnoff@gmail.com, or let Laurie know what articles you want. Everything I've told you is science-based, published, peer-reviewed, and because of copyright, we can't post articles, but I'm happy to send them to you.
Great, thank you. And then let's see, it says 86% misdiagnosed. Therapy could be more effective than medication for many because therapy will address the underlying trauma.
See, yeah, 40 minutes, we didn't get to talk about trauma, but absolutely, yeah.
And then the Opioid Coalition would love for a link to the opioid article as well. So yeah, we'll get folks in touch. And then we have Diane Wolf with a question.
So my question is a little bit off topic, but when I was in training, we used to involuntarily hospitalize pregnant women who were abusing drugs. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how we justify doing that in light of the whole pro-choice movement. So I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
Mm-hmm. Here's the reality. When you develop punitive models of intervention, such as automatic removal of the baby, jailing the woman, involuntarily hospitalizing her, what the public health result is, you have more women that avoid prenatal care and thus bad outcomes. So your outcomes actually get worse when you implement policies like that. From a policy perspective, the thing you want to do is bring in your primary care providers that are giving prenatal care, train them in the models of screening, brief intervention, and gender-specific treatment. And you improve not only individual outcomes, you improve your community statistics also. And we've written and published extensively on that. And again, if you want further information, you can contact me. But Diane, when you said we, I don't know who we is, but that's not a good policy, involuntary hospitalization. All you do is drive women out of prenatal care. If you're interested in this topic, go to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, Ferguson versus Charleston, South Carolina, and a case that I got called into to do expert testimony was that exact kind of case. And the Supreme Court said you can't do that. That's a violation of Fourth Amendment in search and seizure. So there are all sorts of reasons. And again, this is another couple of hours discussion, but
Good
not a bad
questions.
move.
Yeah, good questions and comments for discussion. And then we have another comment at the core. We want to be solution oriented in the ways we support our community's health. Thank you for that feedback, Dr. Chasnoff. Others are agreeing. So, all right. Other questions for Dr. Chasnoff before we end the meeting this afternoon? Great presentation. So thanks so much. Any other questions? Okay. I know folks are appreciating your time. I certainly am, that you are a partner at this in the Healthy Beginnings and Safer Sacramento initiatives and projects. And we will make sure we get information out to those who wanted it. And certainly they can contact you through the Healthy Beginnings site. But I want to thank you directly, Dr. Chasnoff, as well as Albert Tittman,
Thanks.
for joining us this afternoon and giving us your time and expertise in these particular and very different topics for our Meth Coalition. So thank you all very much for joining, and we hope to see you at the
Thanks.
next meeting.